at Stanford University.
So welcome to Lecture 11 of CS193P. This is the fall quarter of academic year 2013-14. And today we're going to talk about two major topics. One is UI table view, which is a very important class. And also we're going to talk about the iPad now. We've been doing everything so far on the iPhone. We want to start doing things actually on both platforms now, iPad and iPhone. And then I'm going to do a demo which is going to, of course, incorporate these two things. So let's dive right into table view. This is a very important class because a lot of times the data that you need to display in your applications comes in the form of a list. Okay, and table view is basically a list view. It's a list of items. It's one-dimensional in that it's just it's not like a matrix or a spreadsheet or something like that. It's one, although it can be divided into sections, which gives it a little more dimension. When we want to display multiple dimension things, like a spreadsheet would be, then we just put multiple table views into navigation controllers. And so users touch rows and we slide in the next row, basically, if you want, or the next column if you want to think of it in spreadsheet type terms. So that's how we do it. The table view itself doesn't manage multi-dimensional data. And there's a lot of different configuration and customizations for table views, and so I have some slides here to show you some pictures of what table views look like. So here's a couple of different types of table views, the two main types, which is the plain style, that's the one on the left, and then the group style, which is the one on the right. The plain style one that I've shown there is also a dynamic table view, meaning that all of its contents are being filled up from some database somewhere. Okay, so you can see here I've got some contacts there. Some of you might be able to guess what all those people are. But anyways, it's just a list from some database, a team database or something. And then on the right, okay, we have a grouped table view. You can see that kind of the things are grouped, right? The little distances section, the map label section, they're kind of grouped together more instead of just having like section titles on the left. And also that one on the right is static. In other words, the things that are in that aren't coming out of a database. They're just kind of fixed in there. It always says in miles. It always says in kilometers. It always says in English. It's just fixed. Okay, so it's a static table. So these two kind of encompass all the different styles that we can do. So let's talk about some of the particular parts of a table view. I'm just going to give them some names so we can talk about them. So at the top of the table view, there's a view, okay, that comes before all the rows, which is the header, the table header. There's a little bit of code at the bottom. That's more for your reference later. That's basically the properties you use to set that thing in the table view. And of course, there's a footer as well. So there's a table header and a table footer. In between is where all the rows are. And the rows are divided into sections, okay? And each section includes some rows, some number of rows. Could be one row, or it could be 100 rows, or 1,000 rows, whatever. And also a header and a footer. So each section has headers. You can see header 0, header 1 for the two sections. We got two sections in this table view. And each one also has footers. Okay, we don't really use the footers that much. We use the headers quite a bit when we have sections in our table view. And then, very importantly, there's the table cells. And this is where the actual data that's coming out of our database or whatever that we're displaying in our table view are coming out of and putting into these table cells, which are actually UI views, okay, a custom subclass of UI view. So that's what we call all of these various parts. This is what it looks like in the plain style. And this is the same things in the group style. So the group style, you see, kind of has a little more gray background. It kind of groups the sections together a little more. Okay. Let me talk a little bit about the sections because sometimes that confuses people. Sections is just a way to group the rows. So here I've got some information with no sections. It's just a bunch of cities, right? Helsinki and Paris and Berlin. And on the right, I've also got a list of cities, but they're grouped into sections by the country. You can see Japan, it's got Tokyo and Kyoto, and then Mexico, it's got San Francisco, something or other there, and Netherlands has Amsterdam. So they're grouped by country, but it's still just a list of cities. Okay, so that's the sections or not. Now in your homework, you're actually going to have to do in fact, this exact thing where you're going to be grouping places by the country they're in. And so you will be using sections in your homework. Okay? In the demo today, I'm not going to do sections. I have to leave you something to figure out on your homeworks. The type of cell. So each cell, each row can have certain types. There's the subtitle type that has like a title and a subtitle there. You see the city and then the country or the region and the country there is the subtitle. Then basic has no subtitle. There's the right detail and the left detail that puts that subtitle information kind of off to the side with a little bit of color or whatever. So these are the 4 different types of cells. And you can also have custom cells where you lay out what's in there completely on your own. So how do you use a table view? Well, 99% of the time we use it with a table view controller. So table view controller, you can just drag it right out. So here we have Xcode. I've got this table view controller example application here, and I'm just dragging a table view controller out of the object palette and into my storyboard, and it puts a whole scene there. Okay? Now that scene's controller is a UI table view controller. That's a class in iOS, UI table view controller. The view of that UI table view controller scene is a UI table view. Okay? When we use UI table view controller, almost always the entire view is a UI table view. Okay? The complexity in that view comes from the cells, what we put in the cells. That's where the information, the data is. We don't usually put a table view and then some other things around it. Although you can do that, you just usually wouldn't use UI table view controller in that case. You're going to do kind of all the things UI table view controller does for you manually, which I'll mention what some of those things are. All right, so we just drag this thing out. We are obviously going to want to subclass UI table view controller so that we can implement our own controller behavior for one thing, view did load and all those things. But also we're going to want to implement the table views delegate and data source, which are a couple of properties that have a protocol, which we're going to talk about, and that's how the data gets loaded in the table. So we're going to do all that stuff in a subclass of UI table view controller. So you can see that I did new file, and now I'm creating it, and you can see that it's a subclass of UI table view controller. I'm calling it my actually, probably my table view controller is what I should call it. Might have called it that on the next one. Yeah, I did. And then, of course, just like any other scene, you're going to click on the controller and go over to the identity inspector and set the class. That's exactly the same as you've done for all your controllers, right? You have to set the class. So here I'm setting it to my table view controller. A little out of sync between those two slides. Anyway, my table view controller, we'll call it. And if I right-click on that controller, okay, and see what its connections are, you'll see that at the bottom of that black window, there's the referencing outlets. Those are 2 properties, data source and delegate. Those are ID angle bracket UI table view data source, or ID angle bracket UI table view delegate. Okay, and the table view controller, when we drag it out, automatically sets itself to be those 2 things. So all the methods in those 2 protocols are going to be implemented by our table view controller subclass right there. And of course, we're actually going to inherit some of them from UI table view controller, which is this nice package that iOS provides to kind of get you going with table views. And we're going to talk about the data source and the delegate and what methods are in there and what we have to do to make this all work in just a moment. But first, let's look a little bit of how we can configure the table view, make it look different ways. So this table view comes out and it's in plain style by default, but I'm going to switch it to grouped so we can see what that looks like. Looks kind of similar. Again, more of a gray around it, more gray area because the rows are kind of grouped together more. These are dynamic cells right now. In other words, they would be loaded by some external data using our data source protocol. But I'm going to switch this to static cells. And when I switch to static cells, first of all, it gave me 3 instead of 1, which is nice. Now, these cells are static, meaning however I edit them in the storyboard, that's what they're going to look like in the program. They're not getting loaded up from any external data source. I'm just editing them right here. It's almost like it's just 3 rectangular views. And you can drag buttons in here, you can drag labels, you can wire up outlets, you can do anything you want in this static table view. Really, the static table view is for things like settings and things like that. Things that, are, the UI of them is fixed. It's not for, contacts and things where you're loading it out of a database. So you can have static. But I'm going to switch back to dynamic here, okay, back to the dynamic cells. So and notice that when I switch to dynamic cells, it says along the top prototype cells, because these cells are actually going to be prototypes, whatever we do here in the storyboard, that are going to be replicated over and over for everything that comes out of our database. So in dynamic mode, we're getting all the data out of a database and we're replicating these prototypes. Also, this is still in grouped mode, right? So I'm going to switch back to plain mode. It still says prototype cells at the top, but now I'm getting more of the plain mode where there's not the gray around the group so much. Also, you can see I have 3 of them there. It's pretty unusual to have 3 different prototype cells when you're loading the stuff out of the database. It would only be if you're loading kind of different things out of the database, you need to display them differently. You might have different prototypes, but most of the time we only have 1. So I'm going to change back to 1 prototype cell. So I have this 1 prototype cell, and it's going to be copied for every single thing that I load out of my database, every row. Okay, does everyone understand what I'm saying by it's a prototype? It's like a template that's going to be copied. So whatever we do here in the storyboard to set this thing up, it's going to look the same, except for the data will be different because it's being loaded from a database, but the layout of it is going to look the same. So what kind of things can we do? Well, let's change this cell to have that subtitle look like a subtitle thing that we cell type, okay? And so now we get a title and a subtitle. So when we pull data out of our database, we're going to want to pull some data that's the title and pull some data that's the subtitle for each row. We can also add a little accessory on the right-hand side of the row. So I'm going to put a special one in here, detailed disclosure. You see it looks like that little information circle, right? An eye inside of a circle. And that's actually a special thing, which I'm going to talk a little bit about later. But there's other ones there. You can put like check marks and just disclosure indicators and things like that. And I'm not going to go through all the things you can do to set up the cell you want. You can drag images in there, all that stuff, but suffice it to say, you can use the inspector there and set your cell up the way you want. So this cell is going to be duplicated for every row now in my dynamic table view. The most important attribute, though, to set in the attributes inspector for a table view cell is this identifier. You see where I've typed in Flickr photo cell right there under identifier? This is the string that we're going to use in our code so that our code knows the cell to replicate. Okay? So, you know, just like when we did a segue and we would type in the name of a segue like display photo or something like that, and then we used it in our code by name. Xcode uses names to sync up between your code and what's in the storyboard because you want to be able to copy and paste entire scenes from one storyboard to another, for example, and you want them to hook back up when they get to the new place. And they do that because by names. As long as the names match, names of classes, names of identifiers, then it'll be hooked back up. And we're going to see that in the demo. I'm going to copy and paste an entire scene from a completely different application that we wrote into my demo application. It's all going to stay hooked up, which is really kind of cool. Okay, so some people think this is kind of unwieldy to have these strings and you have to match them up in your code, and if you mistype a character, now they don't match up anymore, but it's really just using naming to hook these things up, okay? So that's very important, that identifier, and we're going to see that in the code in just a moment. Okay, so let's talk about these 2 really important protocols, the data source protocol and the delegate protocol. Okay, the data source protocol, which is ID angle bracket table view data source, that is the contents of the table view. That's the data that's coming out of our database that's going into the table. In other words, it's the what that's being displayed. It's basically displaying our model, and remember our model is what. So the data source brings the model into the table. The controller uses, the data source is a protocol implemented by the controller to bring the model's data into the view, the table view. The delegate, on the other hand, is for how the table is displayed, how we arrange things, what views we use to show those headers and footers, those kind of things. What if someone touches a row and we want to react to that? That's all the delegate. Okay, it's not about the data that's being displayed. It's more like how are we displaying this table and how is it reacting to touches and things like that. So we're going to talk about both of these delegates, the data source and the delegate. The UI table view controller, just to be clear, I showed this a couple slides ago, it automatically wires itself up as the data source and delegate. If you were going to bring out a generic view controller and